Inside the Capitol, 48 million Americans watched as Melania Trump tried to corner Jasmine Crockett with a veiled strike at President Biden. But in just 3 minutes, Jasmine flipped the ambush into a reckoning, calm, surgical, unstoppable. So what did Jasmine Crockett say that left Melania with nothing? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol looked calm, but something felt wrong. The National Education Innovation Forum was supposed to be a friendly, bipartisan event broadcast live to the nation, focused on reforming schools. But insiders knew why the air was heavy, why people showed up early and tense. Melania Trump had been slipped into the program, at the last moment pushed in by a hard-right media team. Their mission was clear: let her drop one quiet, deadly line. A sentence aimed straight at President Biden without saying his name that would spread online within minutes. The speech was crafted not to spark outrage, but to plant doubt. The cameras were ready, the headlines pre-written. This wasn't about unity, it was a setup. 3 rows back sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, one of the original authors of the education bill. But her name had been erased from the press release. No spotlight, no speech. Just a chair. She was present but made invisible. That was the insult. That was the design. Melania would land the blow. The cameras would record Jasmine's silence. The illusion would be agreement. Jasmine understood. She felt it. And though they tried to erase her, she was already preparing her answer quietly. The warning had come 12 hours earlier, in a single-line email from a hidden source. They're setting the stage. Don't bite. Document everything. No greeting, no explanation. Just a sharp whisper from someone buried deep inside Washington's machinery of deception. Jasmine didn't panic. She'd lived this before in courtrooms where verdicts were fixed, before trials and hearings, where her skin color made her more suspect than the accused. She didn't waste a second. She pulled out her leather-bound folder labeled Counterframe Grace vs. Gossip, slid on her glasses, and began collecting every word Melania Trump had ever spoken under the mask of decency. Every quote about kindness. Every contradiction. Every time she preached dignity while letting the world burn. Jasmine wasn't writing a rebuttal. She was building a record. Now in the Capitol's East Chamber, the pressure was nearly unbearable, but not for her, for them. For the strategists who had staged this ambush like a Broadway show. For the aides pacing nervously behind the curtain, fingers ready to hit post on a soundbite. Melania hadn't even spoken yet. The cameras were locked. The live stream had begun. The audience was stacked with hand-picked donors, party bosses, and 5 reporters known for echoing right-wing spin. The trap was sprung, and then silence. That thick electric silence that comes just before something breaks. The doors opened. Melania Trump appeared like a ghost rehearsing her own legend. Elegant, untouchable, unbothered by consequence. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She floated. Her dress was ivory white, pressed to perfection, carrying the cold confidence of someone who knew her power was image, not policy. Across the room, Kevin McCarthy gave a nod. She answered with the slightest shift in stance. It was enough. The cue was given. The fuse was lit. She reached the podium, nodded once, and let the applause fade by itself. No wave, no grin. Just silence stretched to the breaking point. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, accented, trained smooth. Thank you for coming together today to support the future of American education, she said. It started soft, ceremonial. She praised teachers, spoke of children, even mentioned bipartisan unity. But Jasmine was not fooled. She knew the turn was coming, not if when. At the 2:14 mark, Melania turned the page and dropped her voice a shade lower. Her face hardened. The warmth was gone. The words cut. We must, she said carefully, make sure those guiding our education policies are sharp, aware, and fully in control. She paused, controlled, calculated, because when leaders can no longer recognize the door to their own stage, how can they be trusted to lead our children through one? Gasps rippled quiet, quickly swallowed by professional restraint. No name was spoken, none needed. It was like holding a gun and saying, I'm not shooting, just holding it. Everyone knew the target. Every headline writer knew the clip. This wasn't a comment, it was an assassination, carried on air like poison in the wind. Then came the second strike. When decision makers forget names, places, facts, and faces, it becomes more than personal. It becomes a national risk, especially for our children. There it was, the quiet charge of senility, the branding of the president as unfit, unstable, a danger, behind a smile. Still no name, still no evidence, none required. The dog whistle had become a foghorn. On the Republican side, smug murmurs began to spread, low, satisfied chuckles between polished shoes and crossed legs. One aide typed yes into a group chat, followed by laughing emojis. Across the aisle, Democrats froze their eyes, flicking to one another, waiting for someone to move. But no one did. Not yet. Not out loud. Because they saw the trap. Melania's attack was designed with surgical precision, too vague to rebut, but sharp enough to seize the story. And Jasmine still. Unmoving. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the counterframe folder. Her face calm, but her eyes locked in place. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Because she wasn't watching a speech, she was watching a weapon fired in slow motion. And when you know that you don't panic, you calculate, you remember, you wait for the exact moment to break it apart in front of everyone. Melania had just lit the match. Now the room waited to see if Jasmine Crockett would burn. But Jasmine hadn't come to burn. She came to show the arsonist. The chamber stayed frozen, so did Jasmine. But now every eye shifted toward her, not out of respect, but out of fear that her silence might soon shatter. Jasmine Crockett stood, no announcement, no music, just the slow, steady rise of a woman forced to watch her name, erased her voice, buried her dignity, baited in front of the nation. She didn't look at Melania, not once. To do so would be to join a game she refused to play. Instead, she walked straight to the podium. Each step measured her folder, gripped like a weapon she had forged in secret. Cameras locked onto her and didn't move. Neither did she. She laid the folder down, unfolded a page, folded it in half, quiet, sharp, final. Then she raised her head, stared directly into the camera, feeding the nation, and spoke without a tremor. I came here to talk about the future, but someone decided to drag us back to the oldest trick in the book, mockery dressed up as wisdom. No gasp this time, just silence. Heavy silence. The room realized too late they had been watching the wrong person all along. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't rage. But her words hit harder than any insult Melania had slipped into the air. What the audience had taken as elegance and cruelty was suddenly met by something far stronger, truth delivered with restraint. Jasmine's calm presence had turned into a weapon of its own. She wasn't reacting, she was reframing. And every second of her silence until now had been a countdown to this moment. Her first words shifted the ground, but what came next didn't just challenge Melania's jab. It redefined strength itself. Jasmine leaned toward the microphone only slightly. Not to raise her voice, she didn't need to. The room was already still so focused it felt as if the walls were listening. Her gaze swept across the crowd, Republicans, Democrats, staffers, donors, cameras all waiting for her to lash out. But Jasmine didn't bring fire. She brought memory. When I was 12, she began, I had a math teacher named Mr. Landers. He wasn't famous. He never wrote books. But he taught 3 generations of kids in my district with more patience than most senators bring to an entire term. Her voice slowed, not cracked, steady, careful. By the time I got to his class, he had Parkinson's. She paused not for drama, but to give the story its due. His hands shook when he held the chalk. Sometimes he stopped mid-sentence, not because he forgot, but because he was fighting his body to finish. There were days when the class would wait 20 seconds, maybe 30, in total silence, just for him to write one equation. And we waited. Because we knew something this country keeps forgetting. Slowness isn't weakness. Care isn't incompetence. And silence isn't confusion. She shifted back just a fraction, steady, controlled. Mr. Landers wasn't slow because his mind failed. He was slow because he knew words matter. He knew once they leave your mouth, you can't take them back. So he chose them with care. The air thickened, not with panic, but with gravity. Time itself seemed to slow to match her rhythm. Jasmine didn't look at her notes. Her hands stayed still at her sides. Her voice steady, deliberate, cut deeper than any headline. I never saw anyone laugh at him. Not once. Because we understood something some people in this room still don't. Dignity isn't tied to speed, and wisdom isn't always loud. The chamber froze. You could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner overhead, steady pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. Reporters lowered their pens. A cameraman shifted but didn't dare zoom. A Republican aide fidgeted in his chair. A Democratic senator slowly removed his glasses, holding them like they weighed 100 pounds. Jasmine said nothing else for now. She didn't have to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. The silence after her story wasn't empty. It was heavy, fragile, ready to crack. Jasmine knew the room was listening now. Not because they respected her, but because there was no safe corner left to hide in. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Her strength came from timing, from control. She turned one page in her folder, slow final. The sheet, thick with black ink, had no headline, no filler, just 3 short quotes, bold and clear. She held it up between 2 fingers, steady so the cameras could catch it. Not for theater, for proof. Before I close, she said softly, I want to share a few words that once fueled a national campaign. Words repeated in classrooms and newsrooms and on every major stage. Her voice was low, but the tension shifted. Everyone knew what was coming, and no one could stop it. She read aloud, slow, sharp, exact. Kindness is never weakness. The line hit like a stone in water, simple, heavy, impossible to ignore. Faces in the crowd shifted. They remembered. That was Melania Trump's old mantra, her shield against critics, the phrase she'd used to crown herself above the chaos surrounding her husband. Now it floated like an accusation. Jasmine kept going. Empathy is the foundation of strength. This time the unease was visible. A Fox News producer in the second row dropped her gaze to her lap. A Republican congressman crossed his arms too tightly, jaw clenched. Jasmine let the silence hang. She had studied these words not to mock, but to reveal the gap between what was promised and what had just been delivered on stage. Then came the last line, measured, even unembellished. Don't mock the weak. You may not know their battle. This didn't just sting. It reverberated. Everyone in the chamber, Republican, Democrat, neutral, had just heard Melania Trump break that very creed. They'd heard the dig about leaders forgetting their way to the stage, and they knew who she meant. It had been clever, too clever, weaponized civility made to trend. But Jasmine had flipped it not to insult, but to expose. With all 3 quotes now hanging in the air like indictments, Jasmine lowered the page, placed her hands firmly on the podium, and lifted her eyes not at Melania, but into the camera feeding the country. Her gaze didn't burn. It didn't plead. It demanded. So tell me, what battle were you fighting today, Madam First Lady? Her words didn't shake. They didn't rise. They landed. Calm, sharp, undeniable. A question not meant to provoke, but to confront. A scalpel, not a sword. And it cut deeper. There was no applause, no gasp. Only silence, dense, charged, as if the room had breathed out and refused to breathe in again. Even Melania, seated now with her hands folded, stayed motionless. Her chin tilted a little higher, as though she could still hold her ground. But her body betrayed her. A foot tapped under the table. Her hand clutched her wedding ring too tightly. Jasmine's expression didn't change. She never slid into mockery. That was the point. She wasn't there to trade cruelty. She was there to strip cruelty of its disguise, its branding, its polished lines, its fake grace. She had turned Melania's own words into a mirror. And when she asked, what battle were you fighting today, she didn't expect an answer. She was demanding accountability, and silence itself would speak louder than anything Melania could say. The room held still. You could hear the faint buzz of the studio lights, the shuffle of a cameraman's boot. The squeak of leather chairs sounded too loud. 3 short lines had just unraveled 20 minutes of performance, and Jasmine Crockett had done it without shouting, without breaking form, without losing her dignity. That was the real power. The chamber stayed frozen, but Jasmine wasn't finished. What came next wasn't a rebuttal. It was judgment pulled from a place deeper than politics could reach. She breathed in slowly, one hand flat on the podium, as though bracing against memory. My father, she began, her voice softer now, was a high school math teacher for 30 years. Her words weren't rehearsed. They came like scars pressed in air. He taught in a district most people wouldn't walk through after dark. He stayed because he believed in showing up every day for kids no one else believed in. Her lips pressed together, steadying. He had a way of making geometry sound like poetry. He told us equations were just another way to teach discipline, that logic was a language for kids no one else heard. A thread of emotion edged into her tone, but she didn't stop. He never asked for awards, never made headlines. He just showed up, day after day, year after year. She lifted her eyes, scanning the chamber, not for approval, but for witnesses. At 63, she said, my father began to stumble. He'd forget where he parked. He'd mix up the names of his students. At first, we told ourselves he was just tired, just overworked. But the forgetting didn't stop. Her jaw tightened. The next words came slower, pulled out with weight. One morning, I brought him breakfast. His favorite raisin toast, light butter, strong coffee. I sat across from him and said, "Hi, Daddy." She drew in a long breath, and he looked at me, like I was someone he'd never met. The silence in the chamber thickened. She blinked, but her eyes stayed dry. He smiled politely. "Ask me how my day was." Not as a father, not as the man who used to walk me to school fixing my backpack straps, but as a stranger trying to be kind. Her voice broke slightly, not in volume, but in weight. I didn't lose my father to disease. Her fingers curled slowly against the wood of the lectern. I lost him, the moment the world started treating him like he was already gone, even while he was still breathing. A sharp intake of breath came from the gallery. Jasmine didn't notice. She wasn't speaking only to the room anymore. She was speaking to the entire country. At first it was small things, people repeating themselves to him, slower as if words had turned foreign. Then came the choices, the assumptions, the quiet push aside. Colleagues stopped asking for his input. Friends cut conversations short. Cashiers looked at me and asked if he needed help, as if he couldn't answer for himself. She raised her gaze, locking onto the cameras. They called it kindness. But it wasn't. It was erasure. A polite kind. The kind that smiles at you while it strips you away. She let the pause hang. Heavy. Final. He could still feel it, the way people stopped seeing him. Her tone steadied, now sharper, honed not by anger but purpose. And that's what today brought back to me. She never looked at Melania. She didn't need to. When you frame decline as danger, when you laugh or hint or imply that a man's memory makes him a threat to the nation, you don't just insult that man, you wound every person who's watched someone they love disappear and had to bear that in silence while the world turned their pain into a punchline. Her last line didn't rise. It dropped like the final nail, sealing a truth no power could dodge. You didn't just mock age. You mocked every daughter who's ever had to keep smiling while her father forgot her name. This silence wasn't stillness. It was surrender. Her words had drained the air from the room, not through fury, but with something harder to face, grief sharpened into grace. Melania shifted uneasily. Her hands, once perfectly posed, fidgeted at her wrist. She leaned toward her microphone, slow and measured, but her voice betrayed her careful flat, like a script borrowed from an older version of herself. "I never meant to offend," she began, eyes darting toward the audience. "I was only speaking about leadership and responsibility." She paused, swallowing hard. Her gaze slid past Jasmine, never landing. "We must protect the next generation from uncertainty, from chaos. That is not criticism, that is concern." No applause followed, not even the sound of a shudder. Sometimes we speak with emotion. Sometimes we are misunderstood. Another pause. Too long. The moment had already slipped away. "We all fight different battles, Congresswoman. Some you see, some you never will." But the words fell flat. They didn't land. Because in that moment it was obvious Melania wasn't fighting. She was retreating. And Jasmine moved forward, leading into the sharp closing exactly as planned. She drew in a breath so quiet the microphone barely caught it. Then she leaned in, not to tower, but to make it clear. Her words didn't rush. They landed one by one, steady echoing, like footsteps on stone impossible to ignore. "When you mock someone's memory," she said, each word cut clean, "you don't make them small." Her eyes stayed locked. "You make yourself forgettable." The silence cracked. Not because someone answered, but because no one dared to. Because cruelty dressed up as commentary isn't strength. It's cowardice wearing pearls. She let it sit. Let the cameras adjust. Let every viewer at home realize that subtlety had just been torn apart, not by rage, but by precision. If your values vanish the second someone stumbles, if your decency disappears when age or illness walks into the room, then you never had values. You had performance. Her tone didn't rise, but it struck like a gavel, final, inescapable. Today wasn't a debate, it was a test. And kindness didn't fail. You did. She didn't blink. She didn't smirk. There was no triumph, only truth. Kindness is not a tactic, Mrs. Trump. Flat, exact, like a correction entered into record. It is not a brand, not a slogan, not something to trade, and not a trend. Then came the line that would outlive the event, the headlines, even the storm it caused. Kindness is a standard, one that doesn't vanish when someone forgets your name, one that remains even after the cameras shut off. Whether you remember that or not says less about memory and more about morality. She stepped back. The sound of her breath filled the mic. The room held still. No one moved. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't given a rebuttal. She had delivered a reckoning, and the chamber air would not recover soon. She didn't need applause. Her words had struck like verdicts, not slogans. And as the echo faded, every gaze shifted not ahead, but to the woman who had started it. Melania rose too slowly, almost as if she feared the ground might betray her. Her hands, once folded neatly, twitched at the joints. She didn't nod, didn't adjust her coat. She turned toward the side exit with the stiff grace of someone trained to move as if nothing had broken. But something had. The cameras caught it, a faint tremor in her jaw, the tightening around her lips. Her earlier poise had cracked, and now even her silence showed it. The press surged forward like a wave closing in on a retreat. Mrs. Trump, any comment on Congresswoman Crockett's remarks? One called out. Do you regret your earlier words? Another pressed. Melania didn't flinch, but she didn't answer. Each step seemed measured, not for strength, but survival. Her security detail closed in, carving a path through the shouting press. The cameras never blinked. Neither did the nation. No staffer walked her out. No aide whispered in her ear. Only the sharp sound of her heels striking marble the exit, no longer ceremonial but desperate. She paused just once at the end of the corridor, where a tall mirror stood near the side door. For a second she looked, not to fix her hair, not to force a smile, but to see what was left. Then she turned from it too. Outside, a black SUV waited, engine low and steady. She walked toward it, her face stone. A reporter broke the line, yelling, "Do you still believe the words you used today?" A Secret Service agent stepped in before the question lingered. Melania slipped into the car without a word. The door shut with a heavy thud, too final for a woman who once commanded a room by simply entering. The motor growled. The vehicle slid into Capitol traffic as if trying to leave the moment behind. Inside, the chamber remained frozen. The forum was finished, but the reckoning had only begun. And Melania Trump, once polished into protocol and presentation, left with nothing but her silence and a legacy thinner than the script she never finished. As her convoy faded into the D.C. night like a shadow in retreat across America's newsrooms, something else took hold. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken back, she had sparked a broadcast reckoning. The footage hit CNN's editorial queue at 4:43 p.m. Alyssa Martin, a producer, was the first to flag it, not for what Jasmine said, but how she said it. It was a scalpel, not a sword, she whispered, tagging it priority. Within minutes, the control room scrapped the 5:00 p.m. political panel, choosing instead to open cold with Jasmine's final words. No music, no graphics, just her face, her voice. It aired uncut. And then the phones lit up. By 6:10 p.m., MSNBC had already tossed their lead story. Rachel Maddow appeared on screen, not with her usual stack of notes, but with a single line typed across her teleprompter. Play the clip, then we talk. The silence that followed Jasmine's closing words, whether you remember that or not, speaks less about your memory and more about your morality, was so absolute the control room let it sit 6 seconds longer than normal. Maddow blinked twice. I've covered this building for more than 20 years, she said at last, and I don't think I've ever seen a moment like that, where dignity didn't whisper, it thundered. At 6:44 p.m., Fox News rolled the dice. Their producers had braced for outrage from their base, but even they couldn't ignore the storm already breaking online. Sean Hannity's team aired the clip under the banner, "Crockett's ice-cold attack stunning or shameful?" But what they didn't expect was the studio's response. No clapping, no laughter, just silence. For one rare moment, even outrage stayed quiet. By 7:30 p.m., the Associated Press wire carried it. Their language was cautious, too cautious. Democratic Representative Jasmine Crockett offers measured response following Melania Trump's remarks on leadership. But the networks didn't care about hedging. They were already treating it like an event. CNN called it the Crockett Standard. CBS branded it the moment the room changed. NBC cut straight to it, the speech. On YouTube, the clip shot past 1.2 million views in less than 2 hours. Twitter was harsher, sharper, and far more alive. The hashtag Yawasha Crockett Standard trended across 11 countries. Journalists who had once written her off as performative rushed to issue soft apologies. Conservative pundits tried to spin it. She leaned on emotion, not facts, but their posts drowned under wave after wave of backlash. Because facts weren't the story, the delivery was. And Jasmine's delivery had sliced through decades of noise in under 3 minutes. In living rooms, airports, nail salons, classrooms, anywhere a screen flickered, people stopped. Not because a headline told them to, but because her rhythm carried something timeless: control under fire. In a political arena where shouting had replaced substance, her calm felt like an earthquake. She didn't out-yell her opponent. She weaponized silence. And the nation didn't just hear it, they recognized it. Veteran reporters replayed the details. The way she didn't blink on the word forgettable, the moment her tone dropped before declaring "you had performance." The calm snap of her folder closing not as victory, but as principle. International outlets joined in. The BBC called it a precision strike wrapped in civility. Al Jazeera translated her last quote in full. Der Spiegel's Sunday edition asked, "Is this the face of American political courage?" Now requests poured in. Morning shows wanted her. Producers pitched special segments on democracy and dignity. Her staff declined for now. "Let the words breathe," one aide told MSNBC. "Let the country sit with it." Meanwhile, strategists scribbled notes. Democratic donors circulated the clip in group chats labeled "Next Wave." GOP operatives held midnight calls muttering, "How did we miss this?" In the White House, 2 senior advisors briefed President Biden before dinner. "She just took the hit for you," one said. He didn't answer, only nodded slow and heavy. By 9:10 p.m., nearly every major outlet had run the clip. No edits, no spin, just raw. Because this time, spin would have weakened it. This wasn't a soundbite, it was a signature. A moment so exact it made chaos look cheap. A standard so firm it revealed the emptiness that had filled the room before she spoke. And while pundits argued over what it meant for November, the public wasn't arguing. They were replaying, rewinding, watching again, watching. Because Jasmine Crockett had just proven something almost forgotten in American politics. You can own the room without ever raising your voice. The nation had seen it. The cameras had amplified it. But the ripple was moving somewhere deeper now, into the spaces where character is shaped and memory is built. Her words weren't fading. They were engraving. At Georgetown University, 70 students sat frozen as the clip reached its final moment. The professor, a former diplomat turned rhetoric scholar, let the still frame linger. Jasmine at the podium folder, closed, chin lifted. "This," he said quietly, "is not a rebuttal. It's architecture built from restraint." Behind him a slide glowed, "Speech Under Pressure Case Study 03. Students scribbled furiously, others just stared. His focus wasn't politics, but craft. She didn't interrupt. She didn't shout. She used silence as punctuation. And that he tapped the desk twice is harder than fury. From Stanford to Spelman, the same clip was being dissected like a historical artifact. Not for ideology, but for technique. Professors rewrote syllabi. Communication coaches swapped out old examples for Jasmine's stand. "This is grace under siege," wrote Dr. Eben Morales of NYU in a viral essay among political science students. She didn't shout truth at power. She made power shrink because she never had to grow large to meet it. Meanwhile, in Chicago, inside the headquarters of a leading women-run venture capital firm, a boardroom stopped cold. On a mounted screen, Jasmine's calm voice filled the room. Coffee went untouched. Phones lay idle. When she said, "Sincerity is not a tactic, it's a standard." Whether you remember that or not, the room went still. One executive whispered, "That wasn't a speech. That was a reset." The CEO, a silver-haired powerhouse known for her brutal negotiations, leaned forward and said, "I want her here, not for politics, for precision." 3 days later, Jasmine received a letter hand-delivered by courier, The Art of Silent Precision, a private executive salon, March 22nd, and beneath it a note. "We don't want noise. We want standards, and you just set one." When Jasmine walked into the salon, she wore no campaign colors, no pins, just a slate gray suit and a calm confidence. The room was filled with women who ran hedge funds, hospitals, aerospace firms, women used to leading with data, not drama. And yet when Jasmine spoke, none of them looked away. She didn't retell the story. She didn't relive the viral moment. She broke it down. The power, she said, was never in the comeback. It was in not needing one. She spoke of her father, her years as a teacher's daughter, the line between slowing down and backing down. And when she paused just as she had on that Capitol stage, no one shifted in their chairs. They leaned forward. Afterward, the CEO came to her, hands folded. "I've trained hundreds of women on how to survive hostile rooms," she said, "but I've never seen anyone dismantle a trap with that much stillness." Jasmine smiled faintly. "Stillness," she replied, "is often mistaken for surrender, but sometimes it's when you reload." The moment didn't stay in boardrooms or classrooms. A month later, Harvard Law's Advanced Oratory Under Pressure seminar released a new edition of its textbook. Chapter 6. Crockett's Construct Emotional Economy in Live Debate. Columbia's journalism school launched an elective truth timing and tone in political speech. The University of Chicago created a student-led symposium titled How to Speak When the Room is Against You. In Jasmine's address, it became mandatory viewing not for the content of her policy, but for the discipline of her delivery. Not everyone celebrated. On Capitol Hill, a few lawmakers dismissed her as lucky with one good moment. Yet even some of them began quoting her during debates behind closed doors. One aide admitted anonymously, she didn't just win the room, she rewired it. Now everyone's trying to be slower, calmer, sharper. A meme went viral, Jasmine's silhouette beside the words, "Keep calm and don't flinch." But while her influence grew, Jasmine stayed detached from the spectacle. She turned down 5 late-night interview offers. She rejected a high-profile Vanity Fair profile. On a quiet call with her comms team, she said only, "If it's about me, it fades. If it's about what I said, it lasts." So she kept showing up at schools, not stadiums, at town halls, not galas. She taught people not how to go viral, but how to choose clarity over noise. Back at Georgetown, 2 weeks later, a student raised her hand after watching the clip again. "How did she not get angry?" she asked. The professor smiled. She was angry, but she was fluent in a rarer language restraint. He paused. And restraint sharpened doesn't silence truth. It cuts through noise like glass. What began as a media firestorm didn't stop in newsrooms or boardrooms, it reached somewhere deeper, the classroom. Not just any classroom, but the kind where character is shaped, where leaders are made, where the next generation learns not just to speak, but to hold steady when the room is burning. At Princeton, in a course called Leadership and Moral Dilemmas, the video was played between lectures on Gandhi and Eleanor Roosevelt. But it wasn't framed as inspiration from the past, it was shown as a living example. The professor offered no introduction. She simply said, "You've studied resistance. Now study restraint." The lights dimmed. For 4 minutes, no one blinked. Jasmine Crockett stood frozen on screen folder, shut, chin raised. A senior set to intern on Capitol Hill muttered under his breath, "Damn, that's power." At Harvard's Kennedy School, in an advanced seminar on crisis communication, the video had been replayed 6 times that semester. The instructor, a former White House advisor, paused the clip as Jasmine said, "I didn't lose him to illness. I lost him to the eyes that saw him as a burden." He turned to the class. "That is emotional control. That's someone who can cry without breaking." No one took notes. They just listened. because the lesson was louder than the word's composure, so sharp it made rage look primitive. In Detroit, a room of high school juniors sat cross-legged in a character and citizenship class. Their teacher, a Marine veteran turned educator, used Jasmine's speech as his example. "You think strength is yelling louder?" he asked. "Then watch this. Watch what silence can do." They watched, and for once the restless energy disappeared. Even the loudest boy in the back went still, because what they saw wasn't politics. It was control and chaos. And for kids who grew up in noise, that was power they had never seen. In Aspen at a private leadership retreat, CEOs and executives studied the clip during a session called Strategic Poise, Responding Under Attack Without Losing Center. Jasmine's words followed a reel of world leaders losing their tempers. The contrast was stark. She didn't twitch, didn't blink. Her voice stayed calm. When asked what made her delivery so devastating, one executive said, "It's not what she said. It's what she didn't need to say." Another added, "She didn't defeat her opponent. She made the whole room shrink for trying." The facilitator nodded. Now imagine running your company like that, and at Spelman College in a class on social justice and storytelling, students broke down Jasmine's cadence frame by frame. They studied the breath before her last line, the tilt of her head that showed strength without arrogance. She told her story, one student said, but she never begged for pity. That's power with purpose. Another added, "I want to be that kind of calm, the kind that makes noise look like weakness." Their professor, a former civil rights lawyer, smiled. What she did wasn't performance. It was a reset in how we define authority. At Georgetown Law, ethics classes debated whether Jasmine's calm made her point stronger or watered it down. The answers were split. But one truth was clear: she had redefined what it meant to hold command in a room designed to break you. Her clip was added to a new module called Justice Under Pressure, studied alongside courtroom cross-examinations and police interrogations. Jasmine, a sitting lawmaker, now sat beside case law and historic rulings, not for passing a bill, but for refusing to raise her voice when the whole world tried to force her hand. The Department of Veterans Affairs sent her speech to training programs on empathy and emotional control for trauma care. One instructor explained, "So many of our patients feel invisible, especially when their battles are in the mind. Watching a public figure speak of her father's fading identity without making it only about her pain, that's the kind of respect they deserve." Jasmine's line, "I didn't lose him to disease, I lost him to judgment," was printed on the cover of their new handbook. In corporate seminars across the country, her words became part of EQ Lab's workshops on emotional intelligence for rising leaders. One session was titled, "Holding the Room Without Owning It." Jasmine's video played alongside the Tylenol CEO during the recall, Sully Sullenberger, after the Hudson landing, and now Jasmine Crockett at the Capitol podium. Trainers asked, "Could you hold your tone under that pressure? Could you defend what you love without tearing down what you oppose?" And in the silence that followed, most admitted not yet. Some places didn't need lesson plans. They just needed the clip. At a Brooklyn youth center for undocumented teens, Jasmine's speech played after a week of racial tension. No lecture, no framing, just Jasmine, steady, unbroken, telling her story. A quiet girl raised her hand and whispered, "I think she was shaking inside, but she didn't let them see it." "I want to learn that." The counselor nodded. "That's not taught in books. You learn it in your bones." Even pulpits began weaving her words into faith. In Baltimore, a pastor told his congregation, "Sometimes God doesn't roar in thunder. Sometimes he shows up in a woman who speaks softly and still breaks a storm." And through all the downloads, sermons, handouts, and invitations, Jasmine kept her distance. No retweets, no chasing headlines. When a friend asked if she'd seen her quotes in law school lectures, she smiled and said, "If it's about me, it'll fade. If it's about what I said, it might last." She kept speaking not at galas, but in gym schools and town halls. She wasn't teaching people how to go viral. She was teaching them how to be clear. The political storm had passed, but its echo still rattled the city. Outside, headlines screamed louder than traffic. Inside, Jasmine Crockett sat in silence, not to retreat, but to reflect. The room was dim lit only by a golden lamp casting a warm glow. A light that didn't demand attention, it invited thought. Jasmine sat at her writing desk, upright, shoulders relaxed, a woman who had carried fire all day and now returned to stillness like it was her home. In front of her lay a worn leather journal, its pages fluttering lightly in the air from the vent above. She touched the edge of the paper with care. Not just paper testimony. Her hand gripped the pen without rush. The same hand that had held the podium now moved with the precision of a surgeon, the grace of a poet. Then without flourish, she began to write. I didn't rewrite her words. I rewrote the frame around them. I didn't dismantle her. I dismantled the stage she stood on. She paused, tapped the pen once. Her jaw clenched, not from anger, but from the sharp edge of memory, the moment Melania's tone turned the smirks in the front row, the insiders who thought they had scripted her silence. They brought me to a stage built for my collapse, but I didn't come to endure. I came to strip the noise, to clear the haze, to remind them, empathy isn't performance, it's foundation. The page took in the ink like it had been waiting. Her writing was neat, steady, without hesitation. Truth needed no revision. She exhaled. Outside her window, the Capitol glowed, not triumphant, but steady, a monument caught between history and habit. The city pulsed below, but up here the rhythm was hers. She leaned back, rereading her words. Then in darker ink she wrote, dignity doesn't raise its voice. It raises the bar. From the hallway came muffled voices, aides checking schedules, reporters chasing quotes, phones buzzing with requests from every network between Boston and Brussels. None of it touched her. Another line followed, slower, deliberate. When she mocked the fog in a man's mind, I didn't answer with fire. I handed them the map out. A knock came, soft, respectful. Marcus, her top aide, entered, holding 2 buzzing phones and a stack of fresh press clippings. His face showed exhaustion and pride. Your closing line is everywhere, he said. They're calling it the Capitol silence. Jasmine didn't turn. The speech, Marcus nodded. 6 million views in 4 hours. Fox aired it straight. MSNBC froze the frame on your face and held it. Even The Hill called it a masterclass in calm under fire. Jasmine finally looked up. I didn't retaliate. I know, Marcus said gently. You didn't hit back. You redrew the ring. Then after a long pause, the kind born of years in the crossfire, he added, not as a strategist, but as someone who understood what she had carved from chaos. You didn't just win, you rewrote the rules. He set the phones down and left, closing the door softly. Jasmine stayed still. The city sparkled beyond the glass, but she was somewhere deeper in memory of her father, in the silence she had filled with presence instead of protest. She reached for her journal again, flipped to a blank page and wrote, not about Melania, not about politics, but about stillness. Stillness isn't weakness. Stillness is weight. It's knowing that when you speak, they will hold their breath, not because you shouted, but because you stood. Outside, the wind pressed faintly at the glass. A siren wailed far away, swallowed by the velvet night. Her eyes landed once more on the lines she had written earlier. I didn't change her words. I changed the room around them. She traced it with her finger. Then she closed the journal slowly, not ending the thought, but sealing something sacred. That was her battlefield. And that was her victory. While the media amplified the moment and the public echoed her words on screens and sidewalks, a quieter but just as powerful ripple spread through the country's most elite classrooms. Not applause, but analysis. At Harvard's Kennedy School, the lecture hall wasn't supposed to be packed that morning. Yet within hours of Jasmine Crockett's speech, students poured in, early laptops, open earbuds, dangling whispers buzzing with anticipation. Professor Calderon, a seasoned expert in rhetoric, ethics, and political theater, stood at the podium watching Jasmine's transcript scroll across the projector. He didn't speak right away. He let the class sit in the gravity of her last line. Kindness is not a tactic. It is a standard whether you remember it or not. Silence. Then Calderon tapped the screen. That, he said, is what we now call a strategic counterstrike. Controlled, precise, so restrained it dismantles the opponent's logic without ever raising the voice. He wrote in bold chalk, Crockett Doctrine, silence as structure. Fingers flew over keyboards. At Stanford, Yale, and the Naval War College, similar conversations erupted, not about party politics, but about composure under fire. At Georgetown, one communications seminar zeroed in on Jasmine's phrase, I didn't come to fight fire with fire. I came to remove the oxygen. A student raised her hand, voice shaking. Is that rhetorical de-escalation or moral jujitsu? The professor smiled. It's both, and neither. She didn't throw punches. She redesigned the ring. In the Midwest Northwestern's Women in Leadership course, dissected her pacing her, breathing her refusal to interrupt or even glance sideways during Melania's remarks. Discipline, their professor said, freezing the frame. Discipline under fire. This isn't just dignity, it's a new blueprint for reputational defense. Across the ocean at Oxford's Blavatnik School, a visiting lecturer played the full segment with no explanation. Future diplomats sat in silence, absorbing a woman facing humiliation, with not retaliation but redefinition. When it ended, she asked what just happened. One voice from the back that was power without violence. Another diplomacy disguised as defiance. The last student spoke for all, that was leadership. Soon publications followed. The Harvard Review of Political Communication ran an essay titled, "The Crockett Standard Rhetorical Strategy for the Post-Rage Era." It argued Jasmine's performance marked the fall of performative outrage and the rise of structured calm as a weapon equal in force. Not submission, supremacy through precision. The Journal of Social Influence released an instant analysis charting Jasmine's sentence structure tone and emotional arc alongside historic counterspeeches. Martin Luther King Jr., Shirley Chisholm, Barack Obama, and now Jasmine Crockett. Their conclusion, she didn't just hold the moral high ground, she made the opposition look up at it. At NYU, law professors debated her use of Melania's old slogans. One constitutional law professor played the clip Jasmine, quoting them not with sarcasm but solemnity. She didn't mock the words he said. She lifted them, dusted them off, and made them indict their author. Students scribbled like jurors recording testimony. Elsewhere, a retired Navy comms advisor told new recruits in an ethics workshop, "You don't always need a louder signal. Sometimes the strongest frequency is silence." Remember Crockett. She didn't fight on their ground, she built her own. The University of Chicago hosted a roundtable Speech Under Siege, redefining calm as courage. Jasmine's clip was shown next to moments from Thurgood Marshall and Toni Morrison, not because she was historic yet, but because she had cracked something open. Executive coaching firms soon created seminars called The Crockett Response, aimed at women leaders facing hostility. They studied her steady eyes, her measured cadence, her refusal to flinch even when grief about her father surfaced. The lesson wasn't vengeance, it was control, stillness as strength. One professor in Boston put it plainly, when a woman is publicly undermined, the world waits for her to either snap or shrink. Jasmine did neither. She stood. She shaped the silence. And in that space, the nation heard what usually goes ignored. As professors dissected her restraint and millions replayed her poise, something deeper took root, not in Congress, but in kitchens, classrooms, and offices where power had always been loud and survival had always been quiet. Pulling a Crockett became more than a phrase. It became a quiet manifesto. It slid into language like revolutions do slowly, then all at once. Within 72 hours, women across law, tech, politics, and media used it as code. When a senator brushed off a junior aide's proposal without eye contact, she texted a colleague later. Didn't flinch. Pulled a Crockett. When a public school principal faced pressure to fire a teacher over age and health, she quoted Jasmine at the board meeting and walked out to applause. At a leadership conference in Chicago, a keynote speaker ended with, "Real reform isn't noise. It's timing. It's stillness. It's Crockett." The crowd didn't cheer right away. They inhaled. It was no longer just about Jasmine. It was about every woman who'd ever been called too soft, too emotional, too slow to answer. Every professional who'd ever been told strength meant cutting in. Jasmine didn't teach them to strike back, she taught them to frame back. That subtle shift cracked open a fault line across power itself. On TV, pundits scrambled for a label. Was it a takedown, a rebuke, a rhetorical masterpiece? None of those words fit. It wasn't just clever, it was calibrated. Not just sharp, but surgical. Meanwhile, students across the country began uploading clips under the tag, "My Crockett Moment." A med student in Philadelphia stood her ground when a professor mocked her for choosing geriatrics. She didn't yell. She simply recited Jasmine's words. Kindness is not a tactic, it's a standard. The room froze. The professor stumbled, and the next day her inbox filled. Thank you. You saved me. You pulled a Crockett. Political operatives scrambled. Right-wing hosts mocked the phrase, trying to strip it of weight by branding it a new form of liberal snowflake etiquette. But the sneers didn't stick. The power of Crockett's silence wasn't in what it said, but in what it revealed. The louder they jeered, the smaller they looked. For once, silence wasn't seen as weakness. It was dominance, perfectly timed. Even on Capitol Hill, something strange happened. Republican aides began whispering it with respect. Watch her, one said behind closed doors. If she's quiet, you've already lost. Her method became a new standard. Debate teams practiced how to resist speaking too quickly. At one think tank, a leaked manual listed her exchange under the heading counterattack without collision. In politics, that was heresy. But with Crockett, it was brilliance. The cultural shock hit harder than anyone predicted. A viral ad for a women's legal defense nonprofit splashed the phrase across scenes of women holding steady during layoffs, court hearings, and family disputes. The final shot, a woman at a Capitol microphone. The caption, don't shout, stand still, pull a Crockett. But the ripple wasn't just rhetorical, it was structural. Within months, leadership training programs at Fortune 500 companies began rethinking how they coach women to handle pressure. One HR director admitted on a podcast, we used to tell women to be louder. Now we say listen like Crockett, then choose your strike. And Jasmine, she never claimed it, never trademarked it. She didn't even repost it. Because for her, Crockett wasn't an echo. It was architecture. And her silence had already rebuilt the stage. What she embodied that day at the Capitol, calm under fire, dignity, under insult, wasn't theater. It was correction. Not born out of anger, but discipline. Not shaped by applause, but by pressure. She showed you don't need to crush someone to win. You just need to stand long enough for the truth to echo. As the phrase spread through schools, campaign offices, and even military academies, it became clear pulling a Crockett wasn't just a reaction. It was a reckoning. And yet after all the broadcasts, think pieces, hashtags, and whispered mentions, something deeper emerged, not in headlines, but in the quiet corners of people's hearts. Beneath the politics and the spin was something human. What Jasmine Crockett proved wasn't just the sharpness of her mind or the strength of her will, it was the audacity of grace. In a world that rewards noise over virtue, she chose restraint. In a room built for spectacle, she chose substance. Her silence wasn't passive, it was pressure. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was the discipline of someone who knew real change isn't loud. It's lasting. The real fight that day wasn't against an insult, it was against a culture that teaches us to laugh at fragility, to fear imperfection, to weaponize age and illness as disqualifiers of worth. She stood against all of that, not with punches, but by forcing everyone else to look in the mirror. For every person underestimated because they were older, slower, or gentler, her words were oxygen. For caregivers watching loved ones slip away, her story was a lifeline. For teachers, nurses, single mothers, and quiet workers holding up the nation's spine, her presence spoke louder than any trending soundbite. You are not less because you break. You are more because you rise anyway. That was the rupture no pundit foresaw. Jasmine didn't just answer cruelty with elegance, she unmasked it as cowardice. Melania had tried to draw blood. Jasmine drew lines of decency, of discipline, of judgment held back until it mattered. Those lines redrew the arena. She proved leadership isn't about flawless recall or polished delivery. It's about what you choose to remember and what you refuse to forget. She remembered her father not in the fog of his decline, but in the sharpness of who he was before the world dismissed him. She remembered that value doesn't vanish with memory, and she made the nation remember it too. The lesson wasn't just political, it was personal. It asked every viewer, when someone falters, do you help or do you mock? When someone forgets your name, do you forget their humanity? Jasmine's quiet stand flipped the focus from her opponent back onto all of us. It wasn't a takedown, it was a test. and it left one question ringing in the silence she created. When your moment comes, will you choose power or principle? What she delivered that day wasn't a defense. It was a doctrine that real strength isn't the will to strike, but the wisdom to stay still. That silence sharpened can carry more justice than any shouted slogan, and that sometimes the boldest act in a hostile room is refusing to turn hostile yourself. Jasmine Crockett walked into that forum ready for a fight, but she didn't come to win. She came to redefine the rules, and by doing so, she reminded the country of something dangerously close to being forgotten. Dignity is not weakness. Empathy is not liability. And no matter how far we drift, there will always be voices like hers, steady, unshaken, strong enough to bring us back home. The phrase had already crossed state lines, classrooms, and conference rooms. But by the end of the second week, it wasn't just a phrase, it was a framework. The Crockett Doctrine, coined first as a half-joking chalkboard scrawl at Harvard, had now begun to crystallize into something much heavier, a test of moral leadership. At the White House, late-night meetings weren't about policy alone anymore. Senior aides discussed the Jasmine factor. One strategist summarized it bluntly: the country's exhausted with volume. She gave them velocity. Another added, she didn't just defend Biden. She gave him cover by rewriting the language of strength. President Biden himself had been briefed 3 times on the fallout. Each time the clip was replayed for him in private, not to flatter, but to analyze. On the third viewing, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't resignation either. She did what we forgot to do, he said quietly. She slowed the room down. On the Republican side, panic simmered under the surface. Not panic of defeat, but panic of unpredictability. For years, their formula had been sharp bait mock dominate the soundbite. But Jasmine hadn't bitten. She'd built a different soundscape entirely. At the Republican National Committee headquarters, Kevin McCarthy sat across from 2 media consultants as they replayed her final line on a loop. The words stung less than the silence between them. We can't fight, that one consultant admitted. If we yell, we look brutal. If we ignore her, we look guilty. If we mimic her, we look fake. McCarthy drummed his fingers on the table. So what's the play? No one answered, because for the first time in a decade of politics built on escalation, escalation looked like the losing hand. But the bigger shift wasn't happening in strategy rooms. It was happening in living rooms. In Cleveland, a retired steelworker watched the replay on his daughter's iPad. He wasn't a Democrat. He wasn't even a frequent voter. But as Jasmine's voice dropped to the words, "You mocked every daughter who's ever had to smile while her father forgot her name," he felt something crack. His wife, sitting across from him, reached for his hand without a word. Her father had died of Alzheimer's. For the first time in years, politics didn't feel like noise. It felt like recognition. In Phoenix, a high school teacher played the speech for her civics class. A boy in the back row, notorious for sleeping through lectures, sat bolt upright at the line. Kindness isn't a tactic, it's a standard. Afterward, he asked, "So, does that mean we don't have to be loud to be strong?" The teacher only nodded. He didn't take notes. He just looked different for the rest of the day. In Miami, a Cuban grandmother who spoke little English rewatched the subtitled clip 5 times. She called her granddaughter and said, "This lady, she speaks like my mother. Strong, quiet, but you listen." And then came the international wave. In Berlin, Der Spiegel published a cover story titled "Silence as Power, the Crockett Effect." They compared her restraint to Merkel's notorious calm in crisis meetings, arguing that Crockett represented an American Merkelism the world hadn't expected. In Tokyo, NHK ran the clip in full, with cultural commentators noting how her use of silence mirrored Japanese concepts of mai, the pause that carries meaning. One professor told the anchor, "For once, America looks less like a circus and more like a tea ceremony." In South Africa, a Johannesburg radio host replayed her quote about her father 3 times in one segment. "That's Ubuntu," he told listeners. "Your humanity is tied to mine." She spoke it without naming it. At the United Nations, during a closed-door panel on global leadership narratives, a European diplomat leaned across the table and whispered, "That American congresswoman, she just set the bar higher than the presidency." Of course, backlash arrived. It always does. Right-wing outlets accused Jasmine of weaponizing pity. One headline on Breitbart sneered, "Crockett cries her way to fame." A conservative podcaster laughed into his mic. "If silence is now power, then I guess every time I nap, I'm a revolutionary." But the clips of their mockery didn't land. They were stitched together with Jasmine's calm, her poise, her unbroken gaze. Side by side, the contrast was devastating. Cruelty looked childish. Poise looked like prophecy. Fox tried harder. Sean Hannity ran a segment titled, "Silence Isn't Strength, It's Surrender." But during the live broadcast, the studio audience didn't clap. They just sat watching the split-screen replay of Jasmine's face beside Hannity's raised voice. For a second, it wasn't clear which one was supposed to be the problem. Back in Congress, the atmosphere changed. Lawmakers who once thrived on shouting matches began second-guessing themselves. Staffers whispered that going loud was starting to feel dated, almost embarrassing. In a private caucus, one senior Democrat told his colleagues, "She didn't just raise the floor, she raised the ceiling." Now everything we say is measured against her calm. Even Republicans adjusted. During a heated committee hearing, one GOP member caught himself mid-rant, glanced at the cameras, and lowered his voice. His staffer later admitted he was thinking about Crockett. Nobody wants to look like the opposite of that. And yet Jasmine didn't bask in it. Late at night in her apartment overlooking the Capitol dome, she sat with her journal. The world was calling her moment historic, iconic, unforgettable. But her pen told a different story. "They saw a doctrine," she wrote. "I saw my father." She traced the memory again the morning he didn't recognize her. The polite smile, the stranger's voice in her father's throat. Every headline, every hashtag, every classroom analysis, they all came second to that wound. Her aide Marcus knocked once, entering with stacks of invitations, keynote speeches, book deals, global forums. Jasmine looked up briefly, then closed her journal. "No," she said softly. "Not yet. The moment wasn't mine. It was his." But culture rarely waits for permission. At the Grammys, during a performance pause, a pop star quoted her line, "Kindness isn't a tactic, it's a standard." The crowd erupted. The next day, merchandise appeared online, t-shirts, mugs, posters all tagged "Pull a Crockett." In sports, a WNBA player tweeted the clip after a post-game press conference where she'd been mocked for being too calm. Her caption, "Stillness is where I reload." It went viral overnight. At Sunday services, pastors referenced her restraint in sermons about humility. One minister in Baltimore said God doesn't always roar. Sometimes he whispers through a woman who doesn't blink. Melania Trump, meanwhile, faded from the headlines. Her team tried to reframe her comments as misinterpreted concern, but the clip didn't disappear. It was replayed side by side with Jasmine's rebuttal every time. The comparison became her shadow. In private, Melania reportedly told a confidant, "I thought silence was elegance." She turned it into strength. "I can't compete with that." And she was right. The moment wasn't hers anymore. It never had been. By the third month, political theorists began naming it outright the Crockett Doctrine. Think tanks published essays. One headline read, "From Retort to Reset, How Silence Became Strategy." At Georgetown, Professor Calderon updated his syllabus. Lecture 9, Crockett Doctrine, Silence as Architecture. Students didn't just study her speech, they practiced it. Exercises included speaking for 2 minutes without raising volume, rewriting hostile questions, with calm reframing and mastering the pause that unsettles without provoking. One student wrote in her final essay, "She didn't just resist the attack, she remodeled the stage. She proved silence isn't the absence of power, it's the architecture of it." And yet through all of this, Jasmine stayed the same. She still spoke in town halls more than talk shows. She still wore her slate gray suits, her leather-bound journal tucked under her arm. She still believed the moment wasn't about her, but about what comes next. Because the real test wasn't whether people would celebrate her silence, it was whether they would remember its weight. In her final note that night, she wrote simply, "Strength isn't the strike. It's the stillness before it. That's where change begins. That's where it holds." And with that, she closed the journal, placed it on the desk, and turned off the lamp. The city still buzzed outside. But inside that room, the doctrine had already been written. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.